Welcome to USA Global TV and Radio, where our mission is to provide education, entertainment, hope, and inspiration. USA Global TV and Radio connects you with experts and audiences all around the world every single day to help you succeed in business and to live a richer life. Visit us at USAGlobalTV.com to learn about career and life-changing training and mentoring programs like the Listening Mentor. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our special programs and offers. Discover how you can become a guest on one of our shows or a host or producer of a USA Global TV and Radio show of your very own. That's USA Global TV and Radio, where the doctor is always in.
A very good day to you wherever you are in the world. I am hugely excited to be here in the heart of London on the Strand with an incredible gentleman who I'm going to introduce you to shortly. We are in a building that was established over 300 years ago. We are in a building where 10 generations of family have maintained this incredible brand. We are in Twinings. Liam, who is an official brand ambassador for Twinings, is going to take us on an incredible journey and give you some insights into a little bit about Twinings, and I'm going to pop in some questions, and we might even have a little demonstration going on here. So Liam, very warm welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Joy. Thank you for making the time and effort. And it's so lovely to do this live in your studio, the Tea Salon. For any of you who come to London, we bring our guests to Twinings, and we have the most wonderful experience with Liam taking you on an incredible journey here at the Twinings tasting room. Liam, Twinings, 317 years old, correct?
I'm afraid so.
Who was the founder?
So that was Thomas Twining. That was back in 1706 when he purchased Tom's Coffee House, originally facing onto the back end of this location here. Back then, the southern side where the bank of the Thames would be used to be part of the poorer side of London. And so over the next 10 years, he buys his way through the buildings to gain access to the much more affluent Strand on the northern side. In 1717, he opens the Strand side doorway and starts selling his tea to the good and great of London, directly from his tea store here. Twinings wasn't the first to start selling tea in London. That would be a chap named Thomas Garraway in 1657, but he was the first and longest lasting tea industry here in central London, certainly.
And it's just grown through the generations, is that correct?
Yeah, so Twinings the family of Twining no longer own the company. We fall under the ABF umbrella, but the family is still very closely knit with the company. Stephen Twining, the 10th generation of the family, still works with us on a very frequent basis. We see him coming in every so often. Pleasure of a gentleman. And yeah, we always look forward to it when he comes to visit.
Wonderful. And in this room here, there's so very bad English, so many wonderful paintings of various generations that have walked through the door and part of the family. And on my left-hand side, to Liam's left and my left, there's Mary. I'd love you, because I was fascinated to hear about Mary.
Yeah, absolutely. So after Thomas passed the business over to his son, Daniel ran the company. He was the first Twining to start exporting tea overseas back to mainland Europe and then to the United States, including the mayor of Boston. But sadly, Daniel passed away fairly early on in life due to poor health, leaving his wife Mary to pick up the pieces and run the Twinings Tea Company, the Golden Lion Tea and Coffee Company as it was then known, basically by herself for the next 18 to 20 years until her son Richard joined her in running the business as a family. During this time period, tea was going through a bit of a turbulent time economically speaking. Mainly because there was an incredibly high import tax imposed on the bringing of tea into the UK, 119%. Ever since the time of Charles II, that import tax had grown and grown and grown over the decades, over the past 2 centuries, until it gets to the point where really only the very wealthy could afford to buy tea. However, everyone loved tea. And so those that couldn't afford to buy tea through legitimate means often had to rely on forged or smuggled tea. And this was causing a lot of problems in the tea industry at the time. Mary Twining never took forged or smuggled tea. She kept very detailed ledgers and documents of all the auctions she attended, the merchants she bought from. And so it is, without question, thanks to her, that Twinings maintained his reputation for high quality teas and integrity as a company through that turbulent time period.
Fantastic. And there was it actually caused a disruption in the economy, didn't it?
Yeah, so in 1784, the Commutation Act was introduced to reduce the cost of that tea tax, among other very important things, by a chap called William Pitt the Younger, who was then the Prime Minister. He worked very closely with Mary's son, Richard Twining, to get that done, relying on Richard's expertise in tea, in its trade, to draft that legislation. It saw the reduction of that import tax from 119% to a mere 12.5%, basically making tea instantly accessible to pretty much everyone, no longer needing to rely on smuggled tea, or even worse, forged tea, a substance known as smooch, which was either genuine tea bulked out with other things like slough or blackthorn leaves, or in some unscrupulous cases, just completely made up, fabricated stuff that was not tea in any way. No doubt very, very dangerous, using all sorts of poisonous dyes, copper acetates and sulfates, even sheep's dung was used as an alternative to get the tea looking the right color.
Fascinating. Now, I did read somewhere that there were gangs forming, right? There were smugglers, there were gangs, there was gang warfare over this, wasn't there?
So the tea smuggling gangs became a massive problem during the mid-1700s. Most famous of these gangs would be the Hawkhurst gang. Started around 1735 and lasted to around 1749 or so. And these gangs were not like, it's easy to imagine a couple of little fellas in a dinghy rowing a small quantity of tea across the channel from Europe to England. Not at all. These gangs could make so much money off of the sale of their tea, dodging those import taxes, that they could afford to hire entire ships to transport their goods across. And the Hawkhurst gang was perhaps the most famous of these. At their height, they had something like 500 men under their employ. They were so prolific and notorious in the southeast region of England, Kent, that they could sit in pubs, in inns, in taverns, and just talk openly about their criminal exploits with their guns and their swords on the tables, and no one would raise a finger to stop them. All of that came to a head with the brutal murder and execution by the gang of a chap named William Galley and Daniel Chater, which, as a result of the seizing of a shipload of tea and the breaking into the Pool, a custom house in Poole, led to the gang being pretty much dissolved over the next 5 to 10 years in bits and pieces.
Fascinating. Tea, ladies and gentlemen, at the British School of Excellence, we are passionate about this subject, and it's fascinating how tea has had such a remarkable influence on history, right?
Oh, yes.
Amazing. I mean, just listening to this. And window tax, was that incorporated?
Yes. So going back to the Commutation Act in 1784, initially the plan was that with the lowering of the import taxes, we'd start to import more and more tea to offset the loss of a very high tax. We'd get lower taxes at a much more quantitative rate. Although initially there would be a massive drop in that tea tax revenue. And so to make up for this, I believe the initial proposition was to tax the number of rooms that buildings had. But how on earth would you enforce such a thing? You'd have to send someone round to people's houses. They'd have to be let in and look around the house for all the different rooms. Much more effective then to have your tax inspector walk down the street and simply count the windows they saw. Thus, the window tax was introduced. This is why you'll find, if you're walking around central London especially, lots of these buildings have plastered over or bricked over window bays where you might expect to see glass. Those that could bear to part with their beloved glass windows bricked over as many as they could bear to part with to avoid paying exorbitant window taxes. It's where we get the phrase daylight robbery from, literally stealing people's daylight in the name of taxation.
Oh, fascinating. I love that. It's such a wonderful story. And in the 1800s, it was said that the Duchess of Bedford was so-called responsible for so-called introducing the English afternoon tea. Correct.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Anna Maria Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, very close friend to Queen Victoria herself, is indeed the one who is credited with the creation, or at least the popularisation, of the British tea ceremony of afternoon tea. A million miles removed from the gong fu chas of China or the China Yuan Japan, but a tea ceremony nonetheless, a ritualized way of enjoying tea, focusing primarily on the social etiquette around the tea table. The story goes that she started complaining of a sinking feeling around 4 p.m. in the afternoon due to the fact that at the time the aristocracy would be having a very early breakfast at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and then a substantial dinner maybe as late as 7 or 8 in the evening, and nothing in between. And so to alleviate these pangs of hunger, she started asking that the house servants bring her and her guests tea and sandwiches and scones and biscuits as a way of staving off those afternoon lunches.
I love the story. And then it led to people obviously having these grand afternoon tea get-togethers at one another's homes and that sort of thing. It was quite it was very much for the upper classes, correct?
Oh, yes. So at this point, things like afternoon tea, as we would think of it today, is absolutely still in the upper echelons of society. But at the same time, your average Londoner, your average British person also had their own form of tea. In fact, that's what high tea used to be. What we would call high tea these days is actually, more accurately, low tea. The weird name juxtaposition came about simply because of the heights of the tables. Your aristocracy would be having their afternoon tea at a low trestle table in the garden, the lounge, under the pagoda if they had one, whereas the average British working class family, they would have their strong black end of the day tea with their evening meal at the high table of the house, the dinner table itself. And so the low had high tea and the highborn had low tea. And over the years, the names have become a little bit intermingled because it's hard to look at afternoon tea, all this fine china and silverware, the 3-tiered cake stand, and not think, yes, this is high tea.
Yeah, and it couldn't be further from the truth. And that's fascinating. And there are many hotels that, like you've traveled, and I want to talk to you about your travels. You see beautiful hotels advertising high tea, which is obviously not the correct term for it. And
at this point, they're synonymous. We're not going to call them out for it.
Now, with regard to this journey, this then had an influence on clothing, didn't it?
Yes, you even had tea party dresses. There's a whole kind of area of fashion centered around presenting yourself for afternoon tea. This even tied into the old tradition of tea caddies, ways to keep your tea safe and secure, because harkening back to those times when tea was a very expensive commodity, of course, you need a place to keep it safe. So you have your tea lockbox, your tea caddy, with one key and one key only, that would be on the person of the lady of the house at all times, either hanging around her neck or hidden in her tea party dress, perhaps in a little secret pocket in her sleeve, just to make sure it was safe and secure. This is where we believe that the British custom of the homeowner offering tea to their guests comes from, because no matter what your social standing was, if you were the lady of the house, you would make the tea yourself. You couldn't trust the servants to handle such a precious commodity. And so even though they set the table, they might bring the caddy out, you as the lady of the house, the owner of the house, you would be the one to make the tea by your own fair hand. If your servants were particularly well trusted, you could actually, if you were a house servant, negotiate to have part of your pay in the form of a stipend of tea, which I imagine the wealthy saw as the kind of the lower classes emulating the behaviours of their betters, whereas in reality, they probably just took it and flipped it on the secondary market for a massive profit instead.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, my word. Now, there was the afternoon tea dance, where men wore the beautiful white tie.
Yes.
And ladies, obviously, as we talked about fashion and the tea dress and that. Now, the tea dance was very much, I suppose, introduced for youngsters to in courtships and that sort of thing. Yeah,
it was kind of not necessarily a matchmaking endeavour, though certainly there was a lot of matches made at your afternoon teas, at your tea parties, your dances, and they were kind of for the younger generations of the upper classes to enjoy, to intermingle, and naturally such things come about.
Liam, backstage we were talking, and our wonderful producer asked you a question about how popular is tea in the world today? Where does it sit in, let's say, when we talk about beverage?
Tea is still, and has been pretty much since its inception, the second most popular drink of the human race, second only to water. Alcohol in its various forms, probably in aggregate, catches very close behind, but when it comes to the human race's favourite drinks, it's water, it's tea. Tea has been the number 2 for as long as we've had hot water to boil things in.
Fascinating. I love it. I love this history. You're mindful of information. I hope you're all enjoying this. This is just for me. I'm lapping this up. Loving being in the tea salon, tea studio here with Liam. We are going to get onto some fun things shortly. Tell me, when it comes to your passion for tea, I know you spent some time in China. You landed up there just before COVID, is that
yes, I went out to China to teach English as a foreign language back in February of 2018. I was initially meant to be there for 1.5 years. Then the pandemic happened, and I was stuck out there for another half a year to 1.75 years or so. It was a very interesting experience. I learned a lot. Sadly, I wasn't as exposed to tea as you might expect. I had plans to go and visit tea gardens where I lived in Hangzhou in Zhejiang province, but sadly the pandemic very much put a stop to those plans. And so my love for tea really burgeoned when I came back to the UK, funnily enough. I returned in 2021, and originally I was teaching online, as that was what my vocation was at the time, but I found that teaching online, ironically enough, not dissimilarly from what we're doing now, wasn't for me. But fortunately, a friend of my family had informed me that there was jobs going at Twinings. They were looking for new brand ambassadors to spread the word of tea. And so I thought, why not? That sounds fascinating. It's a new area for me to explore. So came up to London, applied, and here I am now. The last 2 years I've been learning about tea, in some cases quite literally immersing myself in tea and learning all there is to learn about it, and then teaching the people who come to visit us here on the Strand about the history of tea, the categories of tea, brewing, steeping, and all the wonderful things that tea's 2,800 year history, nearly 5,000 year history, 4,800 years has to offer.
Incredible. Tell me again, there's the one and only Twinings shop store.
Yes, so this is the 216 Strand premises where the Twinings company has been based for the last 317 years. Same family, same premises. The Twinings logo that you can see emblazoned behind me on this mug has been the company logo for almost 300 years, making it the longest serving corporate logo in continuous use in the world as far as we are aware. And yeah, this is the original premises, harkening all the way back to 1706 with Tom's Coffee House, spreading through to the Golden Lion Tea and Coffee Shop in 1717, and pretty much remaining unchanged ever since.
Fascinating. Tell me, when it comes to Twinings, we obviously see it pretty much around the world. In most countries, you'll find a stock of Twinings somewhere, right?
We're proud to sell our teas pretty much everywhere in the world. There is a distinct difference that you can find in domestic products and international products. So where you see the Twinings logo as the arched Twinings of London, that denotes something we typically sell the international market, be that unique blends for the United States, for the European markets, for Asia, Australia, and so on. Where you see a thick gold bar of Twinings with gently curving top left and bottom right corners, that is the domestic market logo, the one that we use on all the products like our super blends and the bespoke loose leaf teas that we sell exclusively here at the Strand.
Okay. But people can walk in here and are you able to create a tea for them? Could you blend a tea for them?
We absolutely could. We offer a number of experiences here at Twinings. There's the classic masterclass. That's something that all of our brand ambassadors are trained to deliver. It goes through the history of tea, the history of Twinings, the 6 categories of tea, the plant's biochemistry, ethics, and economics in tea production. And we also have our bespoke blending sessions where you can come in, you can use our teas to make your own bespoke blend. You then get to name that blend and it goes onto our records in our archives. And if you wanted more of your blend for whatever reason, you could call us up and you can order more of whatever you've named your blend to be. It's some of the most fun experiences we do here at Twinings, where people come in and they play around with our different Chinese, Indian, Javan, Sri Lankan teas and make their own unique blend, be it for a special occasion, a wedding, a birthday, or just for pleasure.
I'm seeing the British School of Excellence tea blend being created by you. That sounds fascinating. So that's next step on the to-do list, 100%. Now you're talking about blends and that sort of thing, and I asked you earlier on, what is your favorite tea?
So my favorite tea is what we'd call either a single origin or single estate tea. These are teas that have nothing else added to them. They are just the tea from that garden or from that region. The more geographically precise you get, oftentimes the more expensive, the more exclusive your tea becomes, because you're harvesting from a much smaller, more specific region. My personal favorite is Longjing green tea. And even saying that, it covers a staggering variety of different teas depending on when these leaves are harvested, which particular region. Longjing comes from Hangzhou, from the city where I lived in China for several years. And it's one of China's most famous green teas, Dragon Well green tea, to give it its anglicized name, often referred to as the queen or king of green teas. There is a delightful story about an emperor of China who was traveling through Zhejiang province and stopped in Hangzhou to examine the tea gardens there. But upon receiving word that his mother, the Dowager Empress, had fallen ill, he races back to the capital to tend to his ailing mother. When he arrives, she tells him that she can smell a delightful aroma coming from his robes, and he fishes around in his pockets and finds a handful of Longjing tea leaves he'd stuffed into his pocket in his haste to get home. So he hands this to his servants. They go, they take the tea, they brew and steep the tea, and when they feed it to the Dowager Empress, of course, she is instantly cured of her sicknesses, and it becomes an imperial tribute tea in her honor. Probably a bit fanciful, we're looking at the medicinal properties of the Longjing, but a fantastic story nonetheless, and telling of Longjing's heritage.
Well, I mean, talking of medicinal, I mean, tea definitely has got some, I mean, the quality, well, what am I looking for here? Yeah, they've got healing qualities, and they've got, it's not just sipping a hot cup of tea with maybe milk or black. Tea definitely has healing thing and calming, and
tea does have a lot of healthful properties. It has, especially green teas and yellow teas, are rich in antioxidants, amino acids, flavonoids, lots of very good chemicals that your body wants to make use of. The Chinese, way back during the time of Shen Nung, the discoverer of tea, as we would perhaps recognize it today, did believe that tea had lots of very strong medicinal qualities, healing powers. Today, we're a bit more conscious of the effects of tea, and while it is very good for you as part of a natural and holistic lifestyle, it's not medicine in any way, shape, or form. Lots of tea sellers refuse to make health claims for their tea for that very purpose. But yes, when taken in aggregate as part of a healthy lifestyle, it's full of very useful chemicals that your body is aching to make good use of.
Fantastic. Funny enough, on one of our slide presentations, when we deliver a little bit of the introduction to afternoon tea, the statistics of how many cups of tea were drunk a day in Great Britain alone is just extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's into the hundreds of thousands, right?
It is extremely high.
Yeah.
And England, may surprise you, is not the most avid consumer of tea. I believe it's Iran, Ireland, and then the UK. We actually come in on the bronze podium when it comes to consumption of tea per capita. Those numbers may have changed by now, but yeah, we still drink a lot of tea per head.
Oh, I love a good cup of tea. Talking of a good cup of tea, let's go to what you've laid up to now. We're not going to shift the camera, but Liam's got 6 beautiful tea, what do you call these, tea beakers? Or
these are just mugs, but I've put into each one what we call deep cup infuser. These are probably the best way to make a simple cup of tea in the Western style for yourself. A lot of people are put off from loose leaf tea or whole leaf tea especially, simply because it's considered a bit too much of a faff. There's a lot that you need to do. Absolutely not true. Like, when you are used to making loose leaf tea, it's no less inconvenient than using a tea bag, getting that out of the box and popping that in your mug. Simply put, this is a small metal mesh with lots of little holes in it that the tea leaves sit in while they sit in your mug. The benefit of these ones is that you can put them in a mug, in a cup, in a whole teapot, and just change the amount of tea you're putting in after it. It's why we recommend these over the small cage infusers, the little spherical ones. Yes. They look really beautiful and they're fine for making one cup of tea at a time. But if you're trying to serve multiple people or infuse a larger teapot, you're going to want one like this, or perhaps you get yourself a teapot with a built-in infuser, which can be very, very useful if you're preparing to make lots of tea for lots of people, and especially if you want to reuse the leaves.
Wonderful. So off we go. What are you going to be showing us first off?
So I'm going to take you through a short and very cursory look at the 6 categories of tea. As I say, tea's been around for 4,800 years. 2737 BC is when we have the first real historical milestone for tea in China. But in all that time, there has only ever been one tea species. That is the Camellia sinensis, the camellia from China, to give it a proper name. There are 2 varietals of this tea plant that are the primary varietals from which many other different cultivars of tea are bred. That is your Camellia sinensis, the Chinese tea bush. It's a much shorter plant than its cousin, usually topping out around 10 to 15 feet. Its leaves typically grow to about 3 to 4 inches long. It likes very high elevation, 6,000 feet above sea level, and nice cool temperatures, 10 degrees Celsius ideally. The other varietal is the Camellia sinensis assamica. This was the version discovered in India by the East India Trading Company and was cultivated into the many Indian teas that we are familiar with from places like Assam, for example. Incidentally, that particular varietal of tea is also naturally endemic to China. The tea forests of southern Yunnan in southwest China are also the assamica varietal of the tea plant, and it's from these trees that things for pu'ers, these aged famous Yunnan dark teas, are harvested. But one species, 2 core varietals, and 6 different categories. There are 6 categories of tea, starting with white, yellow, green, oolong, black, and pu'er, or dark tea. And the first one we're going to have a look at is our white teas. These are the least processed of the 6 tea categories. I'll see if I can get us a bit closer to you folks there. So this is very, very young tea leaves, harvested usually quite early in the spring. And in this case, we're looking at a Yinzhen silver needle white tea. So it uses only the unopened buds from the very tip of the tea plant. They take their name from the fact that they are covered in lots of downy hairs. If you ever take hold of one of those, you can feel the little hairs on the tea plant. These form a natural protective barrier for the young tea leaves while they're developing, a form of barrier against pests or insects that might have a munch on the tea leaves. And when they dry, they turn a beautiful sterling silver, hence silver needles, or white tea in this case. Other white teas are things like your Bai Mudan. These would use a bud and an open leaf from further down the stem. But Yinzhen, like we have here, is just the unopened buds from the very tip of the tea plant.
And interesting, just nibbling on that, it's actually quite bitter, isn't it?
Yeah, so because white tea is the least processed, it is plucked, withered and dried, and that is all. All of the chemicals that make the tea plant are still locked inside those leaves. There is a small measure of natural oxidization because nothing is done to stop it, as would be the case in yellow or green teas. But because they are treated with the utmost gentleness and care, very little of that oxidization takes place.
And now that you've poured the leaves into your strainer,
yep,
or your tea caddy, or what would you call it? Your tea
infuser.
Infuser. optimum temperature? What would you in degrees Celsius roughly?
So this depends on the tea that you're steeping. So for this white tea, I'm going to start with around 85 degrees Celsius water. You could go a little bit lower, between 70 to 85 degrees Celsius. 85 is kind of the upper limit I'd recommend for most of your white teas. As this is a yin gen or silver needle white tea, you can leave it to steep for a very long time, 6, 10, even 15 minutes in some cases. Because it's that densely packed bud, it will slowly open as it infuses and absorbs more of the moisture, and you'll get a really developed mellow flavor from it. I'm not going to steep this one for quite that long, as I'm aware that time is limited. So this one we're going to give about 3 to 3.5 minutes or so, which is about as much as I would give Baimudan white tea if I was brewing one of those instead. The extra open leaf in that blend being a little bit more flavorful as in a shorter period. Yeah. So while that's steeping, I can tell you about tea fighting.
Yes,
so tea fighting is a fascinating facet of Song Dynasty Chinese history, where we may be familiar with matcha powder, the whisked green tea of Japan, but the powdering of tea was a practice that began in China prior to tea being exported during the 8th century, during the Nara period. And those teas would have primarily been white teas. The idea was that you and your opponent would meet in the tea house, and you would have your bowl of white tea powder, you would add the hot water, and then you would aggressively whisk your tea at one another until you were told to stop. The person whose frothy bubbles lasted the longest would be declared the victor and would win the tea fight, which is a fascinating and hilarious image to think of. Just these two noble Chinese men whisking their tea aggressively in one another's faces. I think that's absolutely fantastic.
It's priceless, and I love this. Your knowledge is just wonderful. Hence why we're with you. Right. So that, and the term is steeping.
Steeping, infusing, brewing. Steeping is probably the most accurate. To steep is the verb for infusing something in water below the boiling point, and that is the most important part. Although when we brew our tea in tea bags, we have a penchant for boiling the kettle up to 100 degrees Celsius and then going to town, tipping the water over the tea bag. And that's fine for tea bag teas. They are designed with that in mind to infuse very quickly, very hot, for our convenience. But when we're working with loose leaf tea, where we're taking such care with the temperature of the tea, the duration of the steeping, and the amount of tea we use, it would be a shame to overboil the water itself. When you boil water, it starts to bubble and froth, and that is the removal of oxygen from the water. It's why it's always best to use cold water fresh from the tap, then boil it, then use it on your tea. Ideally, you don't reach the boiling point. You stop at around 94, 95 for even your darkest teas, allowing the water to retain some of its oxygen content to give you a richer flavor. The worst thing you can do is boil your water to 100 degrees, make your first cup of tea, let the kettle cool, and then brew it up again to 100 degrees, double boiling the same water, resulting in that really dead, lifeless, old man's water, to give it the translation of the Chinese there. So, here we can see the infused tea leaves of the white tea. They're a little bit darker, they're harder to see now that they've lost their silver shine, but they've also regained much of their green and brown coloration. As the hairs soak up the water, they become more translucent, and you can see the green buds underneath. And here we can see the liquor of the white tea. It's almost, on the camera I can see, just almost as clear as water. It's beautifully light, beautifully pale. Even once I pour it into these cups, it only takes on a slightly very russet amber hue. There we are. Let's see what you think.
Now, there's an art to actual tea tasting.
There is.
And I think I'd like you to demonstrate, because yeah, it's fascinating.
If we were to be sampling our teas properly, I wouldn't be brewing them in these infuser mugs like this. I would be brewing them in tasting mugs like this one here. Again, it's quite hard to see thanks to the glare, but at the front there is actually a series of grooves. These act as a natural filter in the mug, and because they have the lid, once it's finished infusing, you can tip the tea out into a bowl by letting it sit like so. The actual tasting of the tea itself would not be done from these lovely little china cups that we have here, but rather from a tasting spoon, these very broad-headed but shallow bowl tasting spoons, and you would take a scoop of your tea, and when you tasted it, it would be a nice loud slurp, that famous tea tasting slurp. There's no etiquette to tea tasting.
No, there's
whatsoever. Not the complete opposite of afternoon tea. But yes, it would be a nice loud slurp. If you want to try your own semi-professional tea tasting at home, rather than filling your house with the sound of slurping, you can attempt retronasal olfaction instead. It's a very fancy way of saying, let the tea sit on your tongue in your mouth and breathe out through your nose. Because your nose and your mouth are linked through that tube at the back of your throat, a lot of what we consider our sense of taste is actually our sense of smell working double service. And so by breathing out, we're drawing scent particulate up into our nasal cavity from behind, giving us a really strong idea of the tea or the food we're eating's flavor profile without the need to slurp your tea, for example.
Fantastic. Well,
let's see.
Do we say cheers?
We can.
Cheers. We say cheers. It's got a very subtle nose as well.
So white tea does not contain many theaflavins or theorubigens. These are the things that control strength of flavor, color, and taste. Being non-oxidized, not many of these chemicals have a chance to develop in white teas. And so it gives it that beautifully pale liquor and a very, very soft flavor, to the point where I would almost describe white teas as more of a mouth feel than a flavor full on.
Very subtle. Very, very subtle. Liam, am I correct in saying back in the day, there were no handles on tea, and people used to hold their tea or their little beakers like that? Is that true?
So that is one way of holding your tea. If these were kind of classic Chinese-made teacups, they would be much shorter and a little bit rounder. The traditional way of holding a Chinese teacup in the gongfu style, like I have behind me here, you can see the difference in scale between this tiny little teacup and even our tasting cups. It's called Three Dragons Guarding the Ding being the cooking pot that used to sit at the center of a Chinese home. And it is simply a claw of your hand, a bit like a dragon's claw, and the thumb and forefinger rest on either side, and your middle finger supports the base of the cup, so it sits on your hand like so. And that would be enough for one sip, 2 sips, and then in gongfu style you would slurp the 3rd sip to show appreciation for the tea.
Wonderful. Love it. Okay, so this is delicious. Really, really soft on the palate. And talking about palate and taste, food and tea pairing.
Whoa, that is a whole school of thought in its own right. Depending on what kind of tea you're drinking, there is a whole different school for comparing what kind of food you want to pair with that tea. So the Cha-no-yu ceremonies of Japan, they had very strict set menus for their long-form tea ceremonies, where you're sitting there for over 4 hours in some cases, sips of strong green tea interspersed with particular small plated meals or sweets. Afternoon tea, of course, is accompanied by a plethora of goodies: scones, strawberries, creams, savory sandwiches, small cakes, confectionaries. That is much more free form. It's much more to the taste of the individual. But yes, you could absolutely spend days, if not months or years, finding the perfect accompaniment to your preferred brew.
Yeah, wonderful. While you're brewing them, so the next one you're going to bring into play here is?
So the next tea we're going to look at is yellow tea. This would be the one I'd be most surprised of if you heard of before, or if many of our viewers had heard of before. Yellow is the rarest of the 6 categories of tea, to the point where I'd say most people don't even know that it exists. It's believed that initially, according to some schools of thought, yellow tea was the very finest green tea presented to the imperial families of China. But over the years, as various tea farmers and producers competed for the right to give their tea as tribute to the imperial family, the methods for making it changed by accident or by purpose until it was something completely different. Much like green tea, they are very closely related. It's usually the top 3 or 4 leaves from the plant, plucked usually quite early in the year as well, pre-Qingming festival, the new year, to give the finest quality. But if you were to take an apple at home and you slice the apple in half, what visual change you often
It starts
see.
to brown.
It starts to brown. This is what we call oxidization. It's the breakdown of the cellular matter inside the plant by exposure to oxygen after you've broken the cells. It's this oxidization and the leaking of the chemicals within the plant cells that mingles and forms theaflavins and theorubigens. We don't want this to happen in our yellow tea or in our green teas and white teas. And so to stop this from happening, we lock the enzymes within the plant's leaves when we're making green or yellow tea. This is typically done in one of two ways. The most prevalent method in China, and the method that's primarily used for yellow tea, is pan firing or frying, depending on who you ask. Pan firing is simply the tossing of the raw leaves after they've withered for a short while into a heated metal pan or wok, usually starting at around 185 degrees Celsius and climbing to 200 degrees over a span of 5 to 10 minutes in some cases. The leaves are pressed against that hot metal, and the contact with the hot metal is what denatures the enzymes in the leaves, shaking as it's called, killing the green, preventing them from breaking down during the rolling or the pressing or the shaping, and retaining their natural green coloration. The yellow tea's next step is what makes it unique. It is then taken and wrapped up in damp cloth called cow paper. This smothers the tea leaves and cuts it off from oxygen. While cut off in this way, it begins to ferment. The cells begin to break down through microbacterial involvement, oxygen-free or anaerobic enzymatic breakdown instead of aerobic enzymatic breakdown. This is why yellow tea and pu'er, which we'll get onto at the end, are the two fermented teas. Oxidization is not fermentation. It used to be that we refer to all black teas, oolong teas, pu'er teas, oxidized teas as fermented, but as understanding has developed and is still developing, we've moved away from oxidization and fermentation being the same into distinct entities. So this, again, I'm brewing at very low temperatures, only 85 degrees Celsius. Personally, if I was brewing it at home, I might even brew it a little bit lower so that I could reuse the leaves several times over. But here we're going at 85 degrees Celsius. I'm only going to give this about 3 minutes. Okay. Green teas and yellow teas are the easiest teas to ruin. They are the easiest to burn and scald, the most susceptible to high temperatures. One of the reasons that lots of people have a bad experience with green teas in cafes or restaurants is because the knowledge of making green tea is nowhere near as prevalent as the knowledge of making your classic black teas. As a result, your restaurant server, your cafe waiter or waitress, they're doing a million other jobs and they may not know how to make green tea or have the luxury of the time to do so. And so they boil the kettle up, they pour it over the tea bag or the leaves, and it scalds them, releasing all the chemicals inside much too quickly, resulting in that very bitter, unpleasant flavor that has become kind of synonymous with green tea, which often gets hand waved because we think green tea, it's medicinal, it's good for you, therefore it has to taste bad. Absolutely not the case. Things like yellow tea, things like green tea, they only need to be brewed at very low temperatures for short periods. In fact, I'm going to stop this one about half a minute short due to the slightly higher temperature. You can still see, again, it's still a very light liquor, but it has a slightly stronger, brinier nose to it.
Yeah, very much so. Almost very earthy.
Yeah, so you'll find that is in common with the pu'er tea as well. Fermented teas, be they pu'er or yellow, tend to have that slightly earthy, almost petrichor quality to them. Good stuff.
Yeah, it really is good. That is beautiful. And I see exactly what you mean, because absolutely, I've like you, I'm not as anywhere near as knowledgeable as you are, but I know what I like and I don't like. And I've had the privilege of being in China on numerous occasions and with people who really know. And I've been taken to some of the tea plantations, and it's fascinating. I've seen them doing the pans, and it's mind-blowing. And yeah, when someone who doesn't know what they're doing or haven't been taught, then and you get served because you think, oh, I just feel like a green tea, and it comes and it's bitter, and you think, oh, and it's not really drinkable.
No, in many cases it's not, sadly. The best way is when cafes know like their servers have training in dealing with teas. That's fabulous. If not, Always ask if they can bring you the tea with the tea bag still in it. That way you can decide when the tea bag comes out and you don't have to rely on someone else doing it for you.
Absolutely delicious. I love the first one, but I think this really is something quite special.
Excellent.
Just talking of special and noticing a difference of flavor, the cost of these sort of things. Give me some idea of what you're paying per gram.
So, it can vary wildly. Tea at auction today is still done by the weight, and typically speaking, famous names, exclusive gardens still command very high prices for their tea. Darjeeling is a very famous example of high quality tea from a very famous name. Yellow teas are somewhat unique in that despite how rare they are, they're not always that expensive. This is because there's no real demand for them. When those imperial edicts, meaning they could only be sold or given to the imperial family, were gotten rid of, most gardens that used to make yellow tea stopped. It was so much more labor intensive to make yellow tea that they simply switched back to making the much more economically viable green teas instead. And so there are only a few estates in Anhui, Hunan and Sichuan provinces that still produce yellow tea to this very day. As a result, it's hard to find. We've only got one yellow tea here at Twinings, but when you do, I think we charge £14.50 for 50 grams, which is quite a lot when you think about tea off the shelves in Sainsbury's or Tesco. But in the world of loose leaf tea, that's really not that much for a yellow tea, for a high quality loose leaf tea like these are. So yellow teas, if you're looking for something new, if you're looking for something you've never heard of or tried before, yellow tea, things like Huoshan, Hanya are a really good place to start.
Wonderful. All right, let's move on to that next tea.
So, as I said, they were very closely related, yellow teas and green tea, so that's what we're looking at now. This particular green tea is Longjing green tea. It's the one I mentioned previously. It is my favorite, so please...
This is your favorite, is it?
Yeah, please take what I'm saying with a hint of bias. This is Longjing or Dragon Well green tea. It's produced in Zhejiang in southeast China, specifically around the West Lake of Hangzhou. This is what we call Xihu Longjing or West Lake Longjing, and it's considered to be one of China's finest green teas. When I held out the dry leaves to you there, you may have seen the flattened grass blade-like appearance of the leaves. This is because Longjing, unique among China's teas, or almost unique among China's teas, is actually pan-fired multiple times, usually twice, sometimes as many as 4 times in drastic instances. But it's this flattening against the hot metal that gives them that flattened grass blade-like appearance, and with the tea itself, gives it a distinctively roasted chestnut or hazelnut quality. In fact, because the leaves are so roasted, they start to undergo the Maillard's reaction, the same thing that happens in roasted meats, as the sugars inside begin to break down. This means that when these leaves have finished steeping, if I was to leave them on the side for, say, half an hour or so, they'd start to smell as sweet as strawberries as the sugars break down and are released into the air as aroma.
And then could you top it up with some more water?
Absolutely, yeah. Like with loose leaf tea, never throw your leaves away after the first infusion. You can almost always get a second cup out of your loose leaf tea. In the case of some of the tea I'm going to go through in a minute, our Oolong, I would easily make 5 or 6 cups from the same set of leaves, even brewing in the Western fashion as we are here. If I was brewing this in the Gongfu style with a much higher percentage of tea and a much lower quantity of water, I would make maybe 20 cups of tea from the same set of leaves, 20 or 30 in some cases, if I really want to savor it.
Now, I'm just conscious that we've got most probably about 12 minutes to go.
Right.
So I know we could talk till the cows come home.
Oh, absolutely. Talk till the tea steeps. So what I'll do is I'll put the rest of these on now. I'll do a quick showcase of the dry leaves, and then we'll actually just crack on with the sampling of the flavors themselves. So while the Longjing is steeping, here let's take a look at Oolong teas. This is Tiguan Yin. It's a light jade Oolong. Oolongs bridge the gap between your green teas, which are ideally 0% oxidized, but in reality between 0 to 10%, and your black teas, which should be about 100% oxidized, but might be about 90 to 100%. These bridge the gap between, and jade Oolongs typically sit at the lower end of that spectrum, usually below 50% oxidization. You can see this in how much more green the leaves are, whereas a dark Oolong would typically sit at around 50 to 70% oxidization and have a much darker brown hue to those leaves. Dark Oolongs have very, very rich flavors, often quite fruity or nutty, or otherwise vegetal flavors in lots of cases. The Tiguan Yin, being a jade oolong, is much more floral, much lighter, much sweeter as well. So here we can see the green tea, and there is a significant difference in the color of the liquor there. You can see the white, the yellow, and then the slightly darker amber of the green as well. So let's see how you find it. And you should immediately pick up on that roasted, rich, absolutely nutty flavor. Still my favorite after all this time.
I tell you, it's good. I'm just loving this. I think these teas, and I wish all the wonderful people who've taken time to engage with us get an opportunity to watch this back possibly and pick up the names and either order them online or come over to London and meet Liam in person and have a phenomenal experience and let him take you on an incredible journey.
Absolutely. Like, here at the Strand, we're always happy to talk tea. The brand ambassadors and the rest of the team are as knowledgeable as I am, if not even more so. Some of my colleagues have been working in tea for even longer than I have. I've only been in it for 2 years. What am I saying? But yes, we're always happy to talk tea. Drop us a line via the Strand email. You can reach out to me via my email at liam.rose@twinings.com. Or, as you say, please do come down to visit us if you're ever in central London at 216 on the Strand. We're more than happy to talk tea for hours, absolutely. While the oolong is still finishing steeping, we'll have a look at the far end of the scale. This is dark black tea, our classic Darjeeling, a very famous name in the tea industry. But what people may not be aware of is that Darjeeling is not a single monolithic entity. There are 87 gardens or estates in the Darjeeling region, and each produces its own tea independent of the others. So what you get from the Shamong estate, the one that we deal most heavily with here at Twinings, might be completely different from places like Margaret's Hope or Makai Bari or the Castleton estate. Darjeeling also produces green teas, white teas, oolong teas. The single tea plant produces all 6 categories. So in theory, you could make any one of the 6 teas from any tea leaf if you were so inclined. But Darjeeling, most famous for its black teas, for its strong muscatel, fruity notes, but light, delicate overall body. A far cry from the strong, robust, malty black teas of breakfast blends like Assams or Nilgiris down to the southwest of India. Assam is the one that we're probably the most familiar with. It's usually what's put into our tea bags in the form of CTC or cut tear curl teas. These are the strong, rich Assam blends that form the basis of most of our breakfast teas, and are one of the few teas I would recommend pairing with milk. And again, we can see a slight darkening in the colour of the liquor. That will change significantly when we get onto the black tea, as this Tiguan Yin is still quite close to the green tea end of the spectrum.
This, for me, has got a wonderful aroma of almost being by the ocean.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's growing up in Africa, being quite close to the coast. It's got that, like a sea breeze smell to it. I think it's wonderful.
This particular oolong comes from Wuyi in Fujian, China, and it's famous for its floral notes because it grows in the same region as lots of very floral jasmine plants, which impart their character onto the tea plants through the terroir of the soil. You often hear terroir in response to things like wine. The same thing applies to teas. The soil in which it grows is very important. Darjeeling then is famous for that softness because of the very high altitude at which it is grown in the foothills of the Himalayas, and because unlike most Indian teas, it does not use the Assamica varietal of the plant, but rather the Chinese Sinensis varietal of the plant, transposed by British settlers later in the 1800s. So here, let us see how you like it. And there we should see a real difference in the colour of the liquor itself, that beautifully rich, dark amber colour. If I was making a CTC Kenyan black tea or a Assam, for example, that would be an almost ruby, crimson, dark amber colour. But here the Darjeeling, this beautiful, light, fruity flavours.
Now, people talk about the Darjeeling first flush, second flush, the champagne of teas.
Yep. Champagne of teas is a name that I would personally attribute to the pu'er, but that's for another reason. Champagne obviously has those high connotations of quality in its name. Darjeeling is very much the same. Darjeeling teas, the first flush is the very earliest harvest. It's a spring harvest early in the year, kind of end of February, beginning of March period. It's quite a short harvesting window, which means you don't get a lot of tea that you can harvest from it. As a result, those teas are very, very exclusive and very expensive. They are so light, in fact, that if I was brewing it, I would brew it as if it were an oolong tea, around 90 degrees Celsius for 3 minutes, whereas black teas, typically 94 degrees, 95 degrees for 3.5 minutes. The leaves of a first flush Darjeeling are often very green, very sweet, very floral, whereas a strong second flush Darjeeling, like this one here, is summer harvested, much more fruity, much more nutty, slightly more full-bodied, while still keeping that distinctively light Darjeeling character.
It's beautiful. One could add a touch of milk to this, did you say?
You might, but I would ask you to do it while I'm not looking. Darjeelings don't typically want milk added because they are based on that sinensis varietal. They're much lighter, they're much sweeter. Adding a splash of milk might not go awry if that is your taste, but I would advise drinking it black first and then adding a splash of milk to taste. Otherwise, you run the risk of losing those fruity, floral notes that are otherwise present in the Darjeeling. The last tea I'm going to show you folks then is the 6th category. This is pu'er. And here we have a 12-cha pu'er tea cake. This is ripened pu'er. It's split into 2 broad categories. We have our ripened pu'er and we have raw pu'er. Raw pu'ers are incredibly sought after. They are very, very famous teas from Yunnan, the birthplace of tea. If it does not come from one of the 286 villages of Yunnan and pu'er, it should not be called a pu'er tea at all. It is a dark tea, hair cha, to give it its upper name. This comes in the form of a pressed tea cake, which has been steamed once the malcha has developed, which I'll talk about in just a second, pressed into shape and wrapped in paper to undergo bacterial aging. And like with the black tea, I'm going to brew this one at around 95 degrees Celsius for about 3.5 minutes. But whereas with black tea, you're really looking at 2 or 3 infusions maximum. Here with the pu'er, you can just keep going for as long as you want. As many steepings, as many infusions as you can get out of it. Maybe steep it a little longer each time just to maintain the flavor, or steep it for slightly shorter or the same to track the flavor as it changes through each of the infusions. As I say, tea, very, very old. The oldest tea plants that we know of are those semi-wild tea forests in southwestern Yunnan in China. Some of these tea plants have been clocked in at over 2,000 years old and are still producing tea to this day. It's absolutely amazing. The pu'er that we have here is, as I say, the ripened form. The raw form takes much longer to create. The tea leaves are plucked, they are withered, they are pan-fired, they become a green tea, malcha, and they are heaped up into these massive piles of finished tea leaves, and over a course of maybe 70 to 90 days in some cases, as short as 40 days in others, those leaf piles are exposed to the elements of the pu'er valley. Microbacterial culture starts to develop, fungal colonies start to break down the tea leaves. It undergoes a shift in state until it is fully oxidized, dark black, and a very, very fine, almost dense tea mulch. This is then taken to the factories, steamed, pressed, shaped, and wrapped in paper and left to age in underground storage for sometimes as long as 150 years. Some of these ancient pu'ers can be extortionately expensive and have flavors that have developed literally over a century or so. Behind you here on the shelf, I actually have a bean cha tea disc. This is a frisbee-sized solid block of pressed pu'er tea. This one we've had for quite a while, and technically that is still aging, so maybe we'll crack into that someday in the far future. The shoal or ripened pu'er undergoes a much more mechanical process. Rather than being left to the elements of the pu'er valley, it's steamed, it's sprayed with enzymes taken from previous pu'er cultivation to kind of kickstart the elemental breakdown process, and then it is heated up under thermal controlled blankets. This gives the tea workers control over the speed at which that microbacterial breakdown, that fermentation occurs, and means that you can produce it much, much faster. It is then still steamed, pressed, and wrapped up in the paper, but it's not usually aged for anywhere near as long as a traditional sheng or raw pu'er would be. You noted the kind of briny seaweed, sea scent of the yellow tea. Let's see how it compares to the pu'er, which you can definitely see is much darker than anything we've tried so far. Being another fermented tea, that earthy, rich, mushroomy quality is prevalent in the pu'er. It's amazingly good stuff. One of my absolute favourites. Although I have heard it called the Marmite of teas. You either love it or you hate it. Oh, good stuff.
That's gorgeous, isn't that gorgeous? Liam, we've pretty much almost run out of time, and I just have to say, I hope everyone out there has really embraced this episode of Live, Learn, Teach, Inspire. It has just been, for me, an absolute honour to engage with you, and I thank you so much for giving us such a wonderful quality time. Not only quality time, I mean, you're like a walking encyclopedia. I mean,
honestly, we have only just scratched the surface. There is so much more to cover, and it has been a genuine pleasure to talk to all of you about the history of tea, about Twinings in particular, and just to take you through on what is really just the most Cliff Notes examination of some of these amazing teas.
Thank you, Liam. It's an
My
absolute pleasure. Really, thank you to all of you for taking the time to watch this wonderful episode. Do engage with us in the very near future. Lots of things coming up. Keep an eye on our website, subscribe to our newsletters, and look at our social media platforms, the Instas, the TikTok, the YouTube, the Facebook, all of that out there, and watch the space for up and coming events, courses, and the ability and opportunity to connect and engage. So thank you. And hopefully one day you'll come and meet Liam in person for those of you who live outside the UK.
Please do. We'll absolutely be looking forward to it. You can find 216 Twinings on the Strand on Instagram. Or, as I say, reach out to us at the.strand@twinings.com, or to me directly, you can always email me at liam.rose@twinings.com.
That leaves us to say goodbye, and wherever you are in the world, enjoy either your evening, your afternoon, or your morning. Best wishes.